the...
How are they having children already?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name's Russell Dalton. I'm professor of religious education here at Brite Divinity School. The past few years have been challenging ones for people of compassion. We see the devastating effects on human lives caused by a deadly pandemic. Parts of our world are engaged in devastating wars. Migrants fleeing their home for some sort of sanctuary. We see an increase in wildfires, tornadoes, hurricanes, that all have long-term effect on people and communities. And in these times, we ask ourselves, what can we do? How can we be conduits of God's love and justice when faced with these tragedies? Our communities of faith are at work to help people facing such challenges with programs to help coordinate and facilitate our responses. And let me tell you, back when I was in my master's program, I was the teaching fellow for the social ethics professor. I did research on this, and giving to faith-based ministries is a very efficient way to give your charitable dollars, because the churches, even across the world, the churches are there already locally, and so there isn't, and the people are in place, so you're not paying for overhead. Still though, every time we read, listen to, or watch the news, we get a sense that such challenges are only going to increase in the years to come. So again, as people of compassion, we ask ourselves, how should we think about this? How can we envision our response to these challenges as we move into the future? Well, thankfully, we have just the right person here with us to help us start to think about these issues, at least one aspect of our response. Our speaker this morning is the Reverend Courtney Richards. Reverend Richards is the Communications and Development Manager for the Week of Compassion, the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. She received her bachelor's degree from Angelo State University, and that's fine, but most impressively, she received her Master of Divinity from Brite Divinity School. Reverend Richards' natural gifts in ministry rest in relationships. So those things that helping with those connections between individuals, communities, and God's call to be alive and at work in the world. She spent 25 years serving 2 large disciples' churches, and now she brings her gifts and pastoral experience to her role with the Week of Compassion, where she has the privilege to tell the church its own story, reflecting on the many ways holy work is done through partnership to alleviate suffering and transform it into hope. Courtney is married to Brad Lyons, who's well known to many of us on faculty and alumni because he's, where am I here? I know what he is. Because he's the president and publisher of Chalice Press, the Christian Board of Publication. So I'm excited to hear what she has to share with us this afternoon. Her address is titled Week of Compassion, Imagining the Future Response. After her address, there will be some time for questions and answers. So for now, join me please in welcoming Reverend Courtney Richards.
I am really honored to be here and to see friends in the room and new friends on the way. I want to start by asking a couple of questions of you. One of those questions is, what do you already know or think you know about Week of Compassion. What do you know? How did you first hear of Week of Compassion, perhaps other than in the title of today's workshop? Jeremy's making a face at me, so I'm going to call him.
No.
First.
I think the first time I've experienced Week of Compassion was when I moved to Woodward and there had been a tornado, and Week
Sure.
of Compassion helped with the members of the church there getting generators and some financial assistance.
Great. So response in a disaster for a local congregation to receive assistance. Terrific. We are glad that that's one of the things we're known for. Other things we know about Week of Compassion?
Worldwide partnerships with other organizations.
Great.
For larger disaster recovery.
A huge part of our story is the partnership and the global aspect of that, ecumenical global work with our partners. Thanks, Tom. Please.
A couple of weeks ago, I volunteered at our church on Wednesdays and helped get the newsletter out. Well, the lady I was helping was on cruise, so I was getting the newsletter out. And that was the week that we had received the notice, this kind of summary of what Week of Compassion had done in 2022. That was our front page.
Thank
And
you.
I was quite impressed at how many countries were listed. And I didn't have the room it deserved to do as much as we could have, should have.
Sure.
But at least it said all those places with all pins on them are places that will, that, Week of Compassion has helped. And I think visual things like that are really helpful for those of us who don't serve on outreach,
Right.
aren't involved,
Right.
as a lot of other people in the church can be.
Thanks. I appreciate that you share the things that we share. That's exactly why we create them. So we did a year in review of 2022. We create a map. Every time we make a response, whether it's domestic or global, we place a pin on the map to indicate where that is and what has happened, the kind of response that we've made. And so then at the end of the year, we share that map and that list of locations and response efforts for exactly that reason, so that churches will know what's happening and where their gifts are going. So that helps me sort of know a little bit about who's in the room and what's going on. I'm going to turn off this front light so maybe you can see. Since they're actually working, I want you to be able to see the graphics here. So I'm going to do a little bit of a historical review to sort of tell you who Week of Compassion is and how we work. A little bit about what we do from day to day. And then the biggest part of the conversation is about the changing landscape. We know that things that we do in church now are not the way we did church 50 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 5 months ago. Things change rapidly. That is true in congregations, that is true in the larger relationships of the church. And since the theme for Ministers Week is Imagine the Future Church, I want us to imagine the future response. What does it look like to do this kind of work in this changing scene? And then a little bit about that last map pin of you are here. Where do you connect with Week of Compassion? So Week of Compassion, as you've already heard, is the Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. It is a very long name, and I say that it is a long identifier because we cover a lot of bases. So we're going to talk about those. But the three main areas, disaster relief, refugee response, and sustainable development. So Relief, Refugee, and Development Mission Fund. Our mission, very simply, is to work with partners to alleviate suffering throughout the world. I say very simply because the words are simple. The concept itself, obviously, is much more complicated. But that's the distilled version of our mission. Our vision, when we look out, we see a world where God's people transform suffering into hope. We believe that those things go together, and we believe that it's possible. We operate from three core values. We talk about connection. Building relationships matters, whether it's within a congregation, between congregations, between partners and congregations who are connected in a response, or between generous donors as individuals or as congregations who are making sure that the people who are doing the responding have what they need. So connection matters to us. Integrity is critical for us. we want to be sure that we are absolutely transparent about where we work, who we're working with, how we're doing it, and where your gifts are going, so that anyone who gives to Week of Compassion knows that it's being stewarded well. Whether you are giving $1 or $1 million, those are equally cared for and stewarded to the best of our ability. And we talk about accompaniment as a core value. This is a word that's used a lot in the kind of work we do and among the partners that we work with. And the idea of accompaniment is that we're coming alongside. We don't see our role as to be the overseer or the director or the let us tell you how to fix this people. Our role is to come alongside affected communities, whether it's in disaster response or communities that are helping people resettle or communities that are doing sustainable development work. Our role is to come alongside and accompany the people who are closest to the need, because the people closest to the need have the most information about its solution. So Week of Compassion started as a day of compassion. In World War II, as it was becoming more evident that there would be longer war, and that means longer lasting effects of war, the International Convention, or the General Assembly of the Christian churches, got together and said that there would be a day where all churches would collect an offering that would go to support the war recovery effort. Those churches collected those offerings, sent them to European church partners, and that was the Day of Compassion. That wasn't the end of the war, so the efforts continued. And the assembly had two goals. One was to have an immediate response, and one was to have a long-term response. That's still how Week of Compassion works. So as the war continued and as the relief needs increased, they said, let's have a Week of Compassion where churches are collecting special offerings. And the goal in the United States at that point for the disciples was $250,000. That was a huge chunk of money in World War II dollars. So that goal was reached, and that Week of Compassion, every year then, a Week of Compassion offering happened. As needs continued to increase, as the world continued to change, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, as it continued to change, held fast to this idea of being about relief and response. And so we say it's more than a week because it is a full office of the church. We are housed in the office of the General Minister and President as Week of Compassion. Originally, it was led by volunteers, volunteer staff, volunteer coordinators, volunteer storytellers who made sure that the churches had what they needed to talk about the relief efforts, and that when money was received, it was sent back out to our partners. That was all done by volunteers. Eventually, the Christian Church added an executive director to head Week of Compassion. And now, nearly 80 years later, next year will be our 80th birthday, our Ruby Jubilee. So nearly 80 years later, we now have 6 staff in 6 different cities. 3 of us have joined this year. So this is where I get to brag on my amazing colleagues and the work that they do, and I just want you to know their names. I would love for you to know them personally, so if you see them at General Assembly, go celebrate them. Vy Nguyen is our executive director, grew up in Dallas at East Dallas Christian Church. He has been with Week of Compassion 9 years. Caroline Hamilton Arnold is our associate director for domestic disaster response. She's based in Houston. Vy lives in California in the Bay Area. Caroline's based in Houston. She's been with us 8 years. And she does all of the contacting of all of the disciples' churches all across the United States when things happen, floods, fires, tornadoes, earthquakes, all of those things. Those all fall to Caroline. She has an incredible ability to know who's where. Alan Dickin joined the staff just almost a year ago. Next week is his 1-year anniversary. as our Associate Director for Immigrant and Refugee Response. One of the things that we have seen over the years with our partners, our ecumenical partners in the States and in around the globe, is an increased staffing attention to the needs of immigrants and refugees. We're going to talk a little bit more about how that landscape has shifted, but one of the things it means is that the partners we work with on all of our other work also have staff people who do immigrant and refugee response. And so in order for us to work more fully as good partners, it was important for us to sort of match our system to their system. So just in the last year, we've added Alan as the Associate Director for Immigrant and Refugee Response so that our disciples' congregations who are doing the beautiful work of resettlement of families here in the United States have some support and some instruction and are finding each other. One of the great things Alan is doing is helping churches who are doing resettlement work find each other and talk to each other about how that works best. Again, closest to the need, closest to the solution. Risa Spratt is almost a year into her work as well. She started in March. She lives in Oregon and is our disaster response coordinator. She overlaps with Alan and Caroline, and the three of them kind of work in a really great triangle. Risa brings great gifts in Red Cross disaster experience and in community organizing and education. And so she's doing a lot to compile volunteer information and organizing volunteers. She's done a lot of trainings around preparedness and disaster response for congregations and communities. And she brings a great gift to our staff of being bilingual. She is Puerto Rican, and so she has been able to offer to particularly our Florida churches that have so many constant storms coming through, some bilingual and translated workshops and information so that our churches are getting what they need the way they need it. I have been on the staff just a little more than a year. I started in January last year. As Russell said, after serving 25 years in congregations, I had the opportunity to leave the congregation I had been serving in Tulsa and move to St. Louis so that I could actually live in the same house as my husband, which was nice. And at the time, Week of Compassion's previous communications and development manager, Aaron Wathen, had returned to congregational ministry, and so there was a vacancy they asked me to take as sort of an interim, help us figure out what we want to do for the next few months, and it's been my great honor that a few months after that, they said, why don't you stay and do this with us full time? So I've been there full time for about a year now and really love, as I said, getting to tell the church its own story, to say, here's what you're doing and here's how. Suzanne McKay holds us down in Indianapolis. She is our office administrator. She is the one who checks in with our OG&P partners and makes sure that everybody at Disciples Center in downtown Indianapolis has what they need from us and we have what we need from them. And she keeps us all coordinated all the time. Answers all those phone calls and emails and makes sure they get to the right person. So, that changing landscape we've been talking about. We start as a war relief offering for a day. We become a war relief offering for a week. We become a ministry of the church that does work year-round. And then we end up in the season of life we find ourselves now. What does it mean to constantly reinvent the way we do church? The way we are church members, the way we are church pastors, the way we are churches connected to each other, and the way we respond to needs as they arise. At the World Council of Churches Assembly in the fall, one of the primary conversations was, what is driving all of this change sort of from a global perspective? What do we need to all keep our eyes on? And really two things are impacting all of the work we do down the line. Global conflict, wars and rumors of wars, as they say, and the very real impacts of climate change. Here's what that looks like for the work we do. When there are wars, there are people fleeing wars. Ukraine is our obvious, recent, huge example. I will tell you that one of the humbling and bittersweet joys of this work is to sit on a call every other week at some ungodly hour of the morning because it's the afternoon in Geneva. But to sit on a call with partners from our European churches, so the people who do communications work in all of our European church partner organizations, and to talk about here's what Hungarian Interchurch Aid is doing with Ukrainian refugees. Here's how AIDROM, Romanian church, is responding. Here's how Swiss Church Aid is responding. Here's how these churches are responding. And so to get that just wealth of information and sustenance for the work that we do together, to be able to turn around and say to our disciples churches, here's where our gifts are working. Here's where you are making a difference, is really, really quite a joy. So in displacement, that can be one of two things. One is refugee displacement, when someone flees their country to go somewhere else, they're displaced. But there's also internal displacement, and that's a lot of what's happening right now in Ukraine, is that people sort of move from one place to the next place hoping it's temporary before they can go back to the place they left. We saw that a lot during the Balkan conflict as well. In Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia, there was a lot of sort of chasing each other around in circles almost. The Albanians would go to Croatia and the Serbians would go to Bosnia, and they would sort of move to whatever land was open, and it kind of became like squatters' rights. Like, we're gonna stay here until we can't stay here anymore, then we're gonna go somewhere else. So there's the refugee displacement, when someone has to flee their home and does not intend to go back. And there's internal displacement, which is temporary but still extensive, and could be long-lasting, that they are internally displaced still within their own country. Obviously, those things increase when what you're looking at is global conflict and climate change. Because if your home is destroyed by a war or by an earthquake, your home is still destroyed. So there is still that loss and that disaster either way. Migration. Again, sometimes it's war, sometimes it's opportunity, sometimes it's disease. There are any number of reasons that people migrate from one place to another, and sometimes they have to migrate from one place to another and then to another. So there's chain migration, where folks are moving to more than one location, and as global conflicts continue and climate change continues to impact, those chains have more and more links, which means people need more and more resources, and they're farther and farther from what they're familiar with. So it becomes incumbent on the folks who are helping them to have as much information and as much resource and as much interconnection as possible to answer those needs. Drought and flood. We all know, we always say, whatever state you're in, it's Texas weather, it's Oklahoma weather, it's California weather, it's just weather anywhere. Climate is changing, and we always say, wait a few minutes and it'll change. And we never manage to get the rain where we need the rain and the dry where we need the dry. It's always in the wrong spot. So droughts and floods continue to be impacts on all these other things. When there's a drought and your crops will not grow, you can't live there. You can't sustain your family and your community there, so you move. So migration prompted by drought, that's a double whammy, right? Flood, the same thing. When an entire village washes down the side of a mountain, those villagers don't have anywhere to be. They need somewhere to go. So migration continues to be a concern fueled by both conflict and drought, flood, climate. Disaster. We respond at Week of Compassion about every 2 days to some sort of disaster-related response. Sometimes that is an immediate response. There's been a tornado in Houston. Or it is a long-term recovery. Hurricane Katrina, which is several years ago now, still has ongoing recovery projects that Week of Compassion is part of. So responses, when we say every 2 days, it is not that there is a disaster every 2 days, although sometimes it feels like it. We say we respond every 2 days because that is how often and how many partners we're able to connect with to be part of the work that they're doing. Again, climate change and global military conflict both impact disaster response. Military conflict doesn't create a tornado or an earthquake, but if, for example, in Turkey and Syria, if there is an earthquake in an area where there is military conflict, where buildings have already been compromised, and then there's a 7.8 earthquake with 72 aftershocks, and an aftershock is a 7.5, you're looking at significant compromise of already compromised buildings and infrastructures. One of the problems that we're seeing also in Syria and in Turkey is that the refugee populations who had been, back up to the top of the list here, displaced, were already in, they were packed into smaller spaces than you would want to have that many families on a regular basis. And a lot of families couldn't get to safer buildings because there aren't safer buildings. And when buildings were rebuilt after previous conflict or previous natural disasters, they were not rebuilt to code. And so they were compromised. One of my very closest friends in Tulsa has close family, aunts and uncles and cousins in Turkey. And one of the things that her cousin, who I had met when we traveled together, one of the things that Shebo said was when they rebuilt the buildings, they built them out of sand, and now they're sand again. Wow, I mean, and that's just the reality for far too many people in the world. The other piece of this list is illness and how it's impacted by climate change and by military conflict, by global conflicts, may not seem quite as evident as maybe some of the others on this list. But when you consider, I don't know, a global coronavirus pandemic that we've been dealing with, and access to treatment, care, vaccinations, preventative measures, those are all affected by individual agency, by language, by economy. All of the things that affect the first four things on this list also impact how people can respond to illness. And we know that things like drought and flood impact food, which impacts health. And when there's an impact on health, there's an impact on illness. So all of these things feed into each other in quite often the worst possible ways. So what this means, in the grand scheme of things, is that we have a lot to keep up with on your behalf. We're grateful to do that work. We're grateful that you continue to ask us to do that work. And we're especially grateful that you continue to partner with us to do this work together. So, where are you in all of this? Go back through that again. The wrong way. Courtney. There we go. So, here are some stories. My job as a communications person is to tell stories. I want to tell you where you are at work. There's a young man named Dmitry. He is 19 now. He's from the Ukraine. And he and his girlfriend and their best friend who lives next door, all 18-year-olds, as Kyiv was under its sort of initial largest bombing in the spring last year, decided to flee. But they also knew that the best way for them to get to the place they needed to get to in Hungary to catch up with other friends and family was to go into Russia and back around. So these three 18-year-olds make this journey and they get to Hungary. Now when they lived in Ukraine, Dmitry was a soccer player, a footballer. And he was trying out for the national team. We got to Hungary, and they were getting resettled. They were finding a place to live, they were finding work, they were finding a community center that some of our partners with Hungarian Interchurch Aid had established. The longer they were there, and they realized we're actually gonna be here a while, we're probably not going back anytime soon, Dmitry has gotten a tryout with the Hungarian soccer team. So in the middle of war and devastation and tragedy, 18-year-old soccer players are still 18-year-old soccer players. And because of the work of the partners that Week of Compassion works with and supports, and that you work with and support, this 18-year-old soccer player is getting to play soccer. And so hearing those kinds of stories and turning around and getting to tell you those kinds of stories is what really makes this work fun. In Louisiana, a place that has seen no shortage of hurricanes, Hurricane Ida came through 2017, but don't quote me on that date. Hurricane Ida comes through, does massive devastation, and in the recovery process, the different parishes sort of have to line up for services from government agencies, from local response. Everybody has to sort of get in line and take their turn. One of the difficulties of that is that First Nations, Indigenous persons, don't necessarily get the same information in their parts of the parish that the sort of general population gets, for any number of reasons, many of which we can attribute to racism, injustice, economic inequality, and all of the sort of obvious social questions. So, some partners approached Week of Compassion and applied for a grant to support caseworkers, Indigenous people serving the Indigenous population. Now, this is when we are thrilled to get these sort of requests and partnerships and to see the stories that they tell of how it impacts the community to have someone speaking the native Indigenous language and helping them fill out paperwork that they would never have even seen, let alone known how to fill out, to get the response and the relief that they need, to find resources to rebuild their homes on their own land is really powerful. And to be able to say, you're part of that. You are making it happen for those caseworkers to be in those communities and to do that work with their own people. And we're really grateful to be able to tell that story. One of my favorite stories that I've been able to tell over the last year comes out of both Western and Eastern Kentucky. You might recall in December of 21, in the middle of the night, tornadoes in December came through Western Kentucky and leveled many communities. Mayfield was the one that many of us saw and heard about on the news. Whole sections of Western Kentucky just lost entire homes, schools, churches, whole communities flattened. Week of Compassion immediately responded through gifts from the Disciples Church. Hundreds of thousands of dollars came in from Disciples churches and have gone back out in immediate response and are earmarked for long-term recovery projects that are being established and are already ongoing. 6 months later, in July of this past summer, massive flooding comes to the Appalachian Eastern Kentucky region and into Missouri, and whole cities, whole townships are washed away, buildings completely flattened. One of the first checks I saw come through was from a church in Western Kentucky that had been one of the first churches to receive tornado response funds. Now, it gives me goosebumps just to tell you that story. And so to know that that's how disciples are looking after each other is a real gift. The story in Turkey and Syria right now is unfathomable. Numbers that we can't imagine. We had an email that went out today with an update about how our partners are responding in these first 48 hours since the earthquake. If you don't receive those emails from us every other week, weekofcompassion.org, there's a big red button up at the top that says sign up for emails. I'd love to have you join us on that information list. So as I was writing the story yesterday, and then rewriting it after worship, and then got up this morning, I had to write it another time to continue to update the devastating numbers, and I'm sure they've even changed again since we sent the email at 8 o'clock. More than 5,000 people have died. 7 now, thank you. Thousands of people, that many and more, are injured. That many and more are missing. And 10,000 to 12,000 response workers have gone in. Now, one of the reasons that Week of Compassion can respond right away is because of partnerships. The fact that we already knew who to call first to say, what do you need and how do you need it, was because our partners have already been in the region for years and years. It's not a matter of figuring out what do we do and who do we send. They are already there doing the work, building the relationships. They know the community, they know the area, they've responded to conflicts, they've responded to disasters. These are partners who have long-standing relationships there, and our relationships with them mean that when these things happen, we can jump right into that cycle of response and be part of it. So partners are key to what we do. We could not do this by ourselves. We wouldn't want to, but we certainly couldn't do this by ourselves. There is no way that 6 staff people scattered across the United States could do all of the domestic disaster response, all of the global disaster response, all of the immigrant and refugee response, and all of the sustainable development work on behalf of the Disciples Church. There's just no way. But because we have, as disciples, inherent in our being, ecumenical relationships, we model that in Week of Compassion, and we carry those relationships. We have partners around the world, we have partners across the country who are part of this work on a regular basis, who know their communities best, and so when something happens, we know who we can call and say, how do you need us to help you? Back to the accompaniment model. How do you need us to be part of this? We have solidarity grants. Jeremy mentioned when he was at Woodward. When a tornado comes and takes the roof off your church, or when a flood comes and the basement's full, or when a member of your congregation loses their house in a storm, or has damage from an ice storm and a branch falls through the roof, we have what we call solidarity grants. So one of the phone calls that will quite often happen is from someone on Week of Compassion staff, again, usually Caroline Hamilton Arnold, because she's magical and knows these things. She knows who to call in that local community to say, how can we help? How can we respond? Do you have folks who need assistance? What do you need us to do? And these solidarity grants are not huge amounts of money, I will be honest with you, but they are enough to say your church is with you. You've received a phone call and you've received the opportunity to have some sort of response from someone who says, the disciples are with you. Terry Hort Owens, our general minister and president, has taken to saying, when Week of Compassion is there, the whole church is there. Now, she said that and we loved it, so we use it all the time, unashamedly. And I quote her, and I always give her credit for it. But it's true. We don't do this work on behalf of Week of Compassion. We do this work on behalf of disciples. We truly feel that it is our call and our role and our opportunity and our honor to represent the disciples into communities when they're in these moments of crisis. Whether it's here or around the world, disciples can be there because Week of Compassion can be there. Through our partners, through solidarity grants, through storytelling. Every time I get to tell Week of Compassion's story, now you have the chance to tell Week of Compassion's story. You mentioned putting the year in review on the front of your newsletter. That's fantastic. That is exactly why we create those things. It's exactly why we have materials for our special offering in February, all on our website. We have print materials and downloadable resources and mission moments for you to tell, and children's sermons and youth activities, and all sorts of ways that you can tell the story of Week of Compassion, because it is about storytelling. That's how we maintain these connections, is by saying, here's what matters to someone else, and here's how you can be part of that. The other way that we work is, of course, through generosity. We receive a special offering, usually in February. The last 2 Sundays of February are generally designated as the Week of Compassion special offering. But we receive gifts throughout the year. We have folks who support us individually with a recurring monthly gift. We have congregations who have us in their budget as a line item and make a recurring gift every month, every quarter, once a year, whatever it is. We have folks who will respond to designated offerings when there's a request for a particular kind of response. They will designate their gift in that way. We have people who have established endowment funds so that not only the short-term needs are met through offerings, but the long haul of Week of Compassion, well past the life of the person who establishes the fund or the congregation who establishes the fund, Week of Compassion will still have resources to do the work that's needed. So all of these things make Week of Compassion happen. We do not do this by ourselves. Interestingly, when Claudio was preaching last night, and he quoted the verse from Lamentations, not only was it in my brain because it's a great verse, it was in my brain because I have lived and breathed Lamentations 3:21-23, because it's our theme verse for the special offering this month. And this is why we do it. This is the why for us, because we know what brought us to this place. Because we have seen disasters happen and we've seen responses happen. Because we have seen people flee their homes and we have seen people welcome them into theirs. Because we have seen girls in Afghanistan who want to go to school receive the opportunity to have a teacher and their own school books, and it changes their life. Because we've seen this, because we remember all of this, we can have hope. We have to sit in our lament. We have to say 7,000 people is a lot of death. It's a lot of death for anyone. It's a lot of death for a community that's already seen a lot of loss. It's a lot. And we have to say that, and we have to rest in that, and we have to own that. And we remember that every time there has been loss, every time there has been disaster, every time there has been conflict, there has also been the presence of God. And that's where our hope comes from. And that's how we keep doing this work every day. We check in with each other. We know that it's hard. We have partners who check in with us, and we call them. And we know that there is lament and there is loss, and that's part of it. But we also know that there's hope. So that's how we keep going about this work, is really resting in what has brought us here and what keeps carrying us forward, is transforming suffering into hope. I am glad to take any questions that you might have, and if I do not know the answer, I will not make one up, but I will find one and get it to you later. So I'm going to repeat your questions just so that folks can hear as we go, but feel free to ask me anything you'd like to hear about. I'm going to turn the lights back on.
Courtney, I just want to bring up the reminder for the folks who don't know that designated gifts are 100%, no administrative costs are held from those.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. So the two sort of simple distinctions are undesignated and designated. Undesignated gifts are gifts that simply come in and say, here's a gift for Week of Compassion, make use of it however you need it. And those gifts are used with a very low administrative overhead. We say about 4 to 5%. So that is, were we able to be on Charity Navigator, which we aren't because we're under another. People say, why can't we find you on Charity Navigator? I'm like, well, it's because we're under another organization and they're not. Anyway, but were we to be on Charity Navigator, that would be a really high rating at the 4 to 5% overhead. But Dawn is right. When someone designates a gift and says for tornado relief, for hurricane relief, for whatever response, wildfires in Colorado, whatever it is, when it's designated, 100% of what you designate of that money that you give goes to what it's designated for. It may be an immediate response or it may be held for a long-term response, but it will go to that response. One of the things that Week of Compassion is really known for is the long haul. We do the short-term work and the immediate response with our partners, but we also have a whole set of partners who do the long-term recovery, LTRs, long-term recovery groups. Are really where we do a lot of our work. A lot of the work that Caroline and Risa are doing right now is with long-term recovery responses in Kentucky, in Louisiana, in Florida. There's a fourth one that's escaping me at the moment. But there are several long-term recovery projects that we're part of. And one of the great things, when I asked you when we started, how do you know Week of Compassion? What do you know about us? In the ecumenical circles in which we travel, what we're known for is being there till it's over. However long that takes, disciples are there till the end. And we take a little pride in that. That's what we think our call is and where our gifts serve best, is doing that long haul to get all the way through until communities are made whole. Other questions, please?
So every Christmas, I have this conversation with my congregation.
Mm-hmm.
They want to do Operation Christmas Child.
Mm-hmm.
And it's frustrating, but I get it because there's a psychological need to do something tangible with your own hands.
Sure.
So much of Week of Compassion is funding.
Mm-hmm.
So projects would you point us to do something tangible?
That is a great question, and there are many organizations that we could name that folks are attracted to because of the tangibility of the response. And Week of Compassion's work is in funding and partnership, not program development. So it makes it look a little different. I'm actually going to pick on JB because University Christian Church has a great alternative giving program you do that at Christmas, right? And do you want to come up and give me a little spiel about it? That'd be great. Because I don't want to misrepresent it and you're going to tell it much better. So I'm going to let you come up and tell us about what you do. Because I think this will help answer your question.
Thanks, Fred. Hello. Yeah, every Advent season we have a program called Gifts of Hope. I'm Jessica Baqueta. Sorry. Hi. Yeah. We have a program called Gifts of Hope here at the church. It started off as an in-person market, and now it is a virtual market as well. We kind of have an online store through GoDaddy. And Week of Compassion is one of our partners with that, and we have different alternative gifts that people can purchase for loved ones. So they can buy a 9-pound bag of nails or something like that, or a hygiene kit, or whatever it might be. I usually email Caroline and say, okay, can you send me 3 different items? We have something around $5 or $6, something 10 to 20, and then something usually 25 or higher, and then people are able to purchase those for loved ones. They get a little card and a little more information about what that's going towards. So, yeah.
Thank you, appreciate that.
I love that.
And so rather than somebody actually getting the 9-pound bag of nails, what you're doing is giving the money to Week of Compassion, and we're making sure, unless you want to give them a 9-pound bag of nails, which is up to you. But I love the alternative market. That's a great way to do something tangible that connects you still to Week of Compassion, which is your church's ministry, the disciples' ministry. So you're supporting sort of the disciples' work, you're supporting the ethos of Week of Compassion, you're supporting our partners, and somebody has a tangible thing to say, this is what, I'm giving this for you. And I love that idea. I've had several churches that have taken that same sort of model. It's really fun. Other questions, please?
You said that y'all have already contacted, what can we do in Syria and Turkey?
Mm.
What is the first thing that y'all were asked to do?
So the first thing that our partners will do is let the experts get in and do the recovery work. The first thing that has to happen in a massive crisis like that is that the trained professionals who know what they're doing get in and do recovery work. Heavy equipment, all of the sort of life-saving sort of things that have to happen. And then aid stations are usually a first response from a lot of our partners, whether it's water, food, clothing, temporary shelters, blankets. It's the winter, and folks, when there is an earthquake, you're supposed to get out of the buildings that are at risk. So we have all these people just out on the street in the middle of the winter. So it's sort of setting up aid stations is usually a quick response, and then there are longer term responses that start planning almost right away. They may not come into play for 6 months or 12 months or years, but that long-term planning starts right away. In fact, we have a call in just a couple of days to sort of start that first conversation. But aid stations are usually the first thing. The difficulty is that if the whole community is damaged, where do you get the aid supplies? And a lot of times it's from neighboring countries. So that's where like the Ukraine response has involved all those bordering nations getting supplies in and having supplies for people who are leaving the country.
Do y'all work with like World Kitchen or some of those?
That's not a particular partner that we work with personally, but we do have a lot of sort of comparable partners. Most of ours are church related, not exclusively, but many of our partners are church related. Other questions? Please.
So this is sort of a multifaceted question, but
I'll see if I have a multifaceted answer.
on the whole, what kind of a budget are you working with? And I know with added staff and added disasters, your budget's gonna go out the window. But generally speaking, what kind of money do you get to work with, and how do you decide percentages of that to go where?
I'm going to answer that in a couple of pieces, if I can. Our 2022 designated and undesignated giving, so what we received, was about $3 million each, so about $6 million total. That comes in a lot of ways and a lot of pieces over a long stretch. So it wasn't like in November, $3 million show up. I mean, that'd be great, but that's not how it works. If that's how you want to do it, please feel free. But so as gifts come in on a regular basis, one of the reasons that things like recurring gifts from individuals and churches are important is that it's sort of that steady income, so that when there is a tornado, we have something in pocket to turn around and distribute. One of the reasons that endowments are important is that it's a regular distribution from the endowment that is in pocket to then turn around and have for the projects that come along. The way decisions are made, this is gonna sound like a cop-out, but it depends on the project. It depends on the disaster, it depends on the location, it depends on the scale, it depends on the partner. Sometimes a partner will say, here's what we think needs to happen here. Here's what we estimate it's gonna cost to do in 3 phases. It's gonna cost us, however much, $500,000 for 3 phases. Pick a number. And all of the partners that work together will say, we can contribute this much toward that total. So there's sort of a give and take of, we know how it's gonna be used. They're gonna say, here's what it's gonna cost to do all of these things. So that's sort of the disaster response piece. It kind of depends on the partner, depends on the circumstances, and how large scale it is. If it's I don't know how you determine scale of storm damage, but if it's a smaller impact and a shorter term response is really gonna be all that's needed, that will be a different motivator for us than something like a Hurricane Katrina that is clearly gonna be a decade of recovery or more. So some of it is we have to crystal ball it and sort of forecast based on our experience and our partners' experience. More importantly, our partners who are there say, this is what it's gonna take to do this work and this is how long we think it's gonna take to do it. And then we can say, we can contribute X dollars now and X dollars later. And then when we get designated gifts, like Dawn mentioned, that gives us sort of an additional impact that we can make, because things always come up in between. You can be planning for 1 long-term recovery and 3 smaller project disasters happen in between. Sustainable development work is a line item of our budget, and that number changes every year depending on what our gifts are. But our board of stewards, we have 12 members of the disciples who are our board of stewards, and they, at their meetings twice a year, discern funding for sustainable development projects to say, these are applications from partners for education, for healthcare, for community building, for farming projects, for women's business startups, all sorts of things that they're doing in their communities all over the world. They will apply to us and say, we would like you to give $50,000 toward this $100,000 project, and our board of stewards can look at that application and determine how we're able to respond. So it sounds like a cop-out to say it depends, but it does depend. Thanks for asking. Yeah, Dawn?
My statement earlier about the designated gifts, and then piggybacking on Alice, with the addition of all the new staff, do you have any understanding of that impact on the 4 to 5% of administrative costs that come out of the undesignated gifts going forward?
Since it's only been a year that we've added the new staff, I don't know that I can give you a really solid answer on that at this point. I know that part of the reason we were able to add the staff is because of budgeting and endowments and distributions that sort of built up and allowed us to do some long-term planning toward this goal. It just happened that both of the new staff positions came in at the same time, but I don't know what the impact on the administrative number will look like at this point. I would imagine that there was. I wasn't in on it. Okay. So I would have to ask that question and find a better answer for you.
How's the offering held up over the last, say, 10 to 5 years on an annual basis in terms of what you all receive?
We continue to see an increase in our offering year over year.
Good.
that's the short
Because
and
with
easy
definable
answer.
congregations, I was curious how we
Yeah.
building up, so.
It is remarkable, even in, in 2020 when we had, offering materials out and ready to go and then nobody was meeting.
Right.
Or in 2021, when many churches still had not been back in person worship yet, our offering has continued to increase. Both undesignated and designated gifts have continued to increase year over year, and we've added to our endowments annually too. Both in the number of endowment funds and people continue to contribute to their endowment fund. So that means the distribution goes up too,
Good.
which we're grateful for. We know that that's not the story everywhere, and we take that as a responsibility and also as part of the connection and integrity core values that we talked about, that we are trusted to do good work
Right.
with what we're given. Please.
So if designated gifts go 100% to the designation, do generally your church givings from like our outreach committee, who's the one who decides how much money we're sending to where, is there generally received as undesignated? Does it help y'all any if they break part of it out and make it be designated and leave part of it as undesignated in order to go to things like administrative costs?
I appreciate you asking that question. It's a level of thoughtfulness that I wish many of our churches would would have about all of their giving, not just Week of Compassion giving, is how are we doing this and why? It's a great question. The easy answer, the sort of flippant answer, is we'll take it however you want to give it to us. The true answer, is that both are important. So whatever the church feels most connected to and feels serves their congregation's sense of generosity best is what we want to encourage you to do. It is very helpful for us to have the where most needed gift, because you can literally use it anywhere. Designated gifts are used only for the thing they're designated for. We do not designate gifts we don't designate them so narrowly that we can't use them. So like I said, if someone gives to earthquake response, that may be something that we contribute to partners' work immediately, like in the next week, but we may also be still offering distributions to partners from that earthquake response a year from now and 5 years from now. So it will all be used for the designated thing, but it may not all be used the minute you give it to us, but it all gets to where it's been designated. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, because I've not dealt with any of this. When it's designated to earthquake relief, that I would assume means you can use it for any earthquake. You can use it for the one in Syria and Turkey, or you could use it for California relief.
Right, we have sort of larger pools rather than smaller ones, yes. It's a great question. Yeah, Jamie?
Well, and going back to like a tangible piece.
Yeah, please.
Can you talk a little bit about the service opportunities,
Sure.
going to some of those longer term response sites and,
Yeah.
and churches being able to serve?
Yeah, thank you for asking. One of the things that Caroline and Risa and Alan are working on right now is a volunteer database. We have had the ones that we built in Excel, but there's actually a whole system that is being created to do this kind of tracking and information for us. So we have a volunteer interest form on our website that basically says, I would like to do some sort of service. When there's something that comes up that you need people for, let me know what that is. So you fill out that volunteer interest form, we have that, and when things come up like mission sites that we establish in these long-term recovery places, hurricane, tornado, any kind of long-term recovery setting. We had Dayton, Ohio had several tornadoes come through in one night a few years ago. And one of the things that we've done over the last few years is had a mission site, churches there that host groups to come in and work. And we've had a long-term volunteer on site with those groups who's part of Week of Compassion's trained volunteer corps, who will guide those groups through their mission trip, coordinate their work every day, make sure that they have what they need for their stay. So when there are groups who want to do short-term mission trips, a week, a weekend, whatever, we have ways to connect you to either our own mission sites that Week of Compassion has established, or to our partners. Again, back to the whole partnership thing, we don't do this by ourselves. The UCC has set some up. PCUSF, Presbyterian Church, has established mission sites in different places. The Methodist Church, UMCORS, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, have all established mission sites in different long-term recovery sites and settings. And so we work either to get our folks who are interested to our own sites, if possible, or to partner sites as well. One of the partners that we have that's here locally is Be the Neighbor. It's a new organization that's emerging of two sort of similar organizations that do immersion experiences and education and justice work. And Week of Compassion has been a partner with them in the last year, and it's been really fun to have Alan Dickin, who is our Associate Director for Immigrant and Refugee Response, came and met with a couple of the groups in person and also met with each week's group online by Zoom to talk about refugee resettlement and what that means. So we do as much as we can to connect volunteer opportunities and education opportunities, whether they are our own or partners that we work with. And we're always glad to have those conversations. So if you're looking for something, let us know.
Caroline is great to connect you with different organizations
Yeah.
or mission projects or whatever. We've used her lots of years to
Yeah.
find a work site, even to find housing for a mission trip. So
One of the great things about the longevity of our staff, with V and Caroline being in their roles for as long as they have been, and the longevity of the partnerships that Week of Compassion has established, some of which go back our full 80 years. These connections are what make it easier when somebody says, we'd really like to take our youth group for spring break to, be part of a community that needs some help. Where can we do that? Caroline can give you a list of a half dozen different places, tell you to call, make sure that you have what you need, they have what they need, and get everybody in the right place. And that's all because of the relationship building that we do. And that it really does mean that, V can rattle off all of the global connection pieces that we have. Caroline can get you to all the domestic places. Alan can make sure that you have what you need if your church is looking to resettle refugees and be part of that system. Rice and make sure that the volunteers have the information that they need for preparedness, so that if your church has a gym and a shower and you'd like to know how to be a warming station when it's frozen outside, or how to be a shelter when there's a tornado, Rice, I can give you all that information and get you set up. And I just get to tell everybody about all of these things that happen, which is really great. Any other questions before we go? Just a few more minutes, please.
Do you all still do, I know back in the day, there was a lot of in terms of trying to connect our church to Week of Compassion, and how the church I grew up in became very connected was because of invitations to staff to come to the church and to do
Yes.
exactly what you're doing in this room,
Yes.
but with a congregational.
Yes, please invite us to come see you. If we can't do it in person, we'll do it online. I mean, we have all learned about lots of opportunities to be together without having to physically be together, but we can do that, and it doesn't just have to be during February during special offering. Invite us another time. Ask us in August when, we're not doing special offering stuff.
We warn you, you don't want to be invited to Texas in August.
I grew up in El Paso. I know what it's like in August. Very familiar. But yes, we have, again, on our website, under the Contact Us page, there's a button that says, invite us to your church, for worship, for Sunday school, for any sort of workshop training, preparedness training, anything that you want to do to be more ready to serve your local community or to reach outside of your community in service. We want to help you figure out how to do that. So we love to preach, do offering, Sunday school classes, Bible studies, whatever. I will give you all a little heads up. You're the first people outside of the staff I'm going to say this to. And some of you in this room I may be asking to help me with this, so consider this your warning. One of the things that I'm looking at doing this year is creating some materials that can be used year-round and carrying our offering theme past February.
Yeah.
6 weeks of Bible study on the kind of work that we do in Week of Compassion and where Scripture has sent us to do that work. Is that something that churches would like?
Yes.
Okay. Liturgy. We had Casey Thornburg Sigmund, if you don't know her, she's in Kansas City, fantastic preacher, wrote our sermon starters and exegetical work for this year's special offering material, did a gorgeous job with it. Some sermon starters for preachers who want to do this kind of sermon and don't really know where they can get the resources for it. We should have those available for you. So one of the things on my 2023 goals list is to do some of this resource generating for you. I see my pal Derek back there who did the youth activities for this year's special offering materials. So we have lots of these kind of things that we want to keep generating for you past the special offering itself. So keep an eye out for that over the next several months. Please.
Maybe even a vacation Bible school.
Sure.
Taking-
Yeah.
Our church did a Habitat for Humanity
Mhm.
vacation Bible school.
Yeah, and that's a great model. They have one, Heifer International has a really good VBS too. I'm like, we could Compassion could do one of those. So yeah, that's exactly what we're thinking about. Thanks for asking.
One last
Okay, Ronnie,
weird question.
just because it's you, I've known you for so long, I'll let you.
But have we ever thought about changing the name? That is the thing that I get
Right.
asked the most about.
Right.
Don't start with me over here at pension fund.
So, yeah, so Week of Compassion, that conversation happens periodically. I was on the board of Week of Compassion for 4 years while I was a congregational pastor. Happened then, that was 15 years ago. I know that it has happened among the current staff at least a couple of times. The board raises the question periodically. It's tricky. It's not impossible, but it's complicated. One of the things that has happened though is that there is an organization called Compassion that's not us. So it makes it a little complicated. So we're very clear, and we always use Week of Compassion. We never use WOC. We always use our full given name. We don't have a nickname anymore. We only use our given name, Week of Compassion. But it is complicated, and it's one of the reasons that sort of a throwaway line that became kind of a slogan was, it's more than a week, right? I mean, that's where that came from, was trying to explain it's not just a week offering anymore. At the end of World War II, it's a full-blown ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So the conversation does happen from time to time. I would not expect a change anytime soon, but it is a conversation that happens.
It happens in local congregations a lot too.
Yep, I know. It did
That's why
when I was there.
wanted to
Yeah,
confirm.
it did. They were like, that's such a weird name. I'm like, but it's such a great ministry.
Exactly.
That's always my answer.
Well, and
Yeah.
I started in churches that I served a month of Week of Compassion.
I love it.
And that's what we're doing at Monte Vista.
I love
so
it.
that each week of February,
Mhm.
we're highlighting different aspects
Yep.
of Week of Compassion and opening it up for designated
Mhm.
or undesignated,
Great.
whatever people want to give.
I love the
But keeping it in
creativity of our
front it,
congregations. That's great. Thanks,
because
Don.
It keeps it in front of them longer than just a couple of weeks.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will be here the rest of the day, the rest of Ministers Week. I am thrilled to have these conversations in any combination that we want to. Russell, thank you for hosting the room. I'm sorry we didn't have a microphone for you to run around
Yes.
with. I just did it
Run
myself up
around.
here. And you have a couple of things before we go, so I'm going to get
Yes.
out of your way. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Courtney.
And thanks to all of you. Possibility, work of compassion. I don't know, it's better than the month of apathy. I want to remind everyone that in about 15 minutes downstairs, Dr. Kalia Williams will present the Davis workshop. It's When Worship Breathes, Reimagining Liturgical Practice for Fresh Encounter. So I'm, just downstairs in Walker Hall. So you have plenty of time to get there and maybe some more conversations amongst yourselves. But thank you for coming.
Thank you all.